Welcome to DevOps Decrypted, episode 22, where we talk all things DevOps. I'm your host, Laura Larimore, here with our Adaptavist panel, Matt Saunders, Rasmus, Jobin, and we also have our CIO Neal with us today as well. We have a special guest today, Gene Kim, who is a Wall Street Journal best-selling author and researcher. Welcome, Gene.
I'm so happy to be here. Good afternoon to you all. Good morning here.
So, Gene, we have copies of the Phoenix Project and the Unicorn Project in all of our offices. But now I hear there's a new book to be adding to the library entitled Wiring the Winning Organization. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what it was like writing this book and what generated the idea for it?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Thank you for the question, Laura. Yeah. So maybe as some background, I've been studying high-performing technology organizations since 1999, and that was a journey I started back when I was a CTO and technical co-founder of a company called Tripwire in the information security space. And so I was there for 13 years. I left in 2010, and so our goal was to study these amazing high-performing organizations that were the best at dev, the best at ops, the best at InfoSec and compliance, and we want to understand what how did they make their good-to-great transformation. So that we could so we could figure out how other organizations could replicate those amazing outcomes. And so the big surprise in that journey was how it took me into the middle of the DevOps movement, which I think is so urgent and important. And one of the most amazing things that happened in that journey was meeting Dr. Stephen Spear at the MIT Sloan School of Business. And that was in 2014. And I cannot overstate just how much his thinking has influenced my own. In fact, the DevOps Handbook was at least 1 year late because of that course. It was like, oh my gosh, we've missed so many important things. And so the quest that we've been on for 3-4 years is really trying to figure out what is in common between Agile, DevOps, the Toyota production system, Lean, safety culture, resilience engineering. And our conclusion is really that they're all incomplete expressions of a far greater whole. And I got to tell you, it's been the most intellectually challenging thing I've ever worked on, but also the most intellectually rewarding because they say the goal of science is to explain the most with the least, and I think it's really been dazzling to say in any transformation there's really 3 mechanisms of performance, and you can express everything we see, in terms of these kind of other frameworks, through these very 3 simple things. Anyway, so that's what I've been working on, and it's been so fun to have the book finally out there and actually getting people to react to it. I'm hoping that it was rewarding and at least interesting to read.
It was also interesting to listen to. So I was on it with Audible. That's the way that I listen to my books these days. And it was interesting to hear you talk about. You're right. You made the assertion that not only have you found something sort of fundamental, first principle that leads up to Agile DevOps, you were even talking about team topologies. You're talking about a lot of these other principles falling under the same general construction. How did you land on this being the underpinnings of the construction? Like, are the ifications the underpinnings that you're referring to?
Yeah. Right. That's fantastic, Neal. So there's 3 of them. Let's give them some names. And maybe I'll answer that. Let's say what they are first. Yeah. So we're saying that basically there's really 3 mechanisms which leaders use to make it so that people can do their work easily and well. And I think that's really the underpinning assertion that we make is that, since the job of leaders isn't to actually do the work, it stands to reason that their job must be, to help others do their work well. And we're saying that there's kind of 3 main ways they do it. One is that they have to slowify. There's some problems where you don't want people making all their mistakes in production environments where the consequences are so high you can't undo, you can't learn because learning is fundamentally experimental and experiential. And so that one's all about slowing down to speed up. We have many adages for that, stop sawing to sharpen the saw. It's interesting that there's no word in English that actually says that one concept, the notion of making a short-term investment for a longer-term gain. So we thought it was important enough where we actually made up a word. The second is about simplification. So the first is slowifying, so moving some work in time, so it's not in production, but in planning and practice. The second one is making the problems easier to solve. And so we know that people are very bad at solving problems, and it's very difficult to solve problems when everything is in a big intertwined big ball of mud where small actions in one spot can ripple out and cause massive global chaos and catastrophic outcomes. And so simplification is all about dividing large problems into small ones. So, one of them is like waterfall to agile, right? Incrementalism. The other one's about modularization, like that's the Amazon API re-architecture project. And the other one is sequentialization, linearization. So that's the Toyota production system. It's for sequential activities. So what modularization does for parallel activities, linearization does for interdependent sequential activities. And the third one is about amplification, the notion that we have to take weak signals of failure and amplify them so they can be decisively acted upon to prevent, detect, or correct better. So, to answer your question, Neal, the process was really trying to show all these disparate practices, across all these different frameworks, like, whether it's Conway's Law, whether it's team topologies, all these things that we know are important, and then try to synthesize what is a simpler whole. And I love the saying, anyone can take something complex, anyone can take something simple, make it complex. It's a little more of a trick to take something complex and really make it simple. Anyways, sorry for the long answer.
No, that's great. I mean, I learned a lot from that simple, quick answer itself. Quick question. All these ifications, it does make a lot of sense. But at the same time, by the way, I'm the head of DevOps here at Adaptavist. And when we go and transform organizations, there's a question that might arise. Why slowification? That's the opposite of what we are trying to achieve, right?
Yeah.
I mean, simplification, amplification, yeah, absolutely, we get it. We want to do it, right? Why should we be slowing down? The point of hiring you or getting your help or, moving to this new fancy tool is to, do it 1,000 times a day, right?
Yeah.
Why should we even slow down? So can you maybe go a little bit deep into that particular ification? If you don't mind.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you're so right. I think in fact, right. We don't want to be doing 4 releases a year that don't feel so good. We want to do more like 136,000 per day, right? Like that Amazon reported doing in 2015. And you're talking about slowification, or maybe it sounds like, we want to ship more features, and yet you're trying to, pay down this quote technical debt, right? And do things that don't sound like features to me. And so what they have in common is the notion that at some point, we have to slow down to speed up. And that's not free, right? And there's been so many attempts to be able to say, quality is free. You have to, this is a short-term correction, for a longer-term gain. And we thought it was interesting that there was no word in English that had this. The Germans do, and it's called Verbesserung. The notion of you're deliberately slowing down, to speed up in the long term. And we actually hypothesize that maybe the absence of a specific word in the management literature actually prevents us from actually saying and expressing something that's actually very important. If you can't say it, you can't think it, maybe. So there are many other words that we looked at. One was deceleration, but it's like the point isn't to decelerate, right? The point is, you want to ultimately accelerate. Maybe one other thing that we thought was really important about this was that one of the influences, the primary influence for slowification is Dr. Kahneman and Tversky. So that's Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. So Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for his contribution, saying there's really 2 modes of thinking. This mode 1, system 1, which is all about slow, deliberative, contemplative, creative. And then there's mode 2, which is system 2, which is all about sort of instinctual, fast biases, habits, routines. And, when we are doing most work, we are often, we only can access most of the time system 2, right? To actually figure out how to do things differently requires activating system 1. And we say that, there's something very specific that needs to happen in knowledge work as well, right? Is that we have to sort of trigger the slowification so we can activate system 1, so we can actually develop new modes of thinking, develop those, we've got to figure out what's actually going on so we can automate it. We've got to figure out, how to reserve time, to actually, do the automation work, right? Again, for that longer term gain.
Yeah, and I had thought about it too, because I've been in a similar boat as Jobin on the whole, slowification is a great word for a book. It gets people talking, which is probably on purpose. But then when you're trying to sell something to clients, it's like, whoa, what are you doing here? And I was also trying to think about it behind the scenes, like related to the Agile Manifesto and all these kind of things. Like, it's not really so much that you're trying to slow everything down. It's that you're trying to be more thorough or even more like mindful. So it's almost like a slowification is more like a thoroughification or mindful-ification. But mindful and other terms have gotten, hyped up on other things too. But I can see it makes sense that, yeah, you are slowing down to go faster. You're really just making space to be more thorough and thoughtful in your process.
Yeah, I love what you just said, Rasmus. I mean, I think I love the fact that you said, yeah, it embodies a concept that you've developed over time, a sensibility. And my fondest hope is that people will be able to, in their daily work, or when they find themselves in situations where things are going terribly wrong, and the learning can't happen right now, and we have limited ability to undo, that people will say, this is an opportunity for us to slowify and do all these things like, tabletop exercises, better planning, do rehearsals, to do, set ourselves up so that we can get to a place where, the example that we use in the book is Chaos Monkey. Chaos Monkey is one of the best examples of slowification, where they made all these investments so that ultimately they were able to deliberately inject faults in the production environment so they could always get a sense of confidence that they could survive things when inopportune things happen, which is a reason why in April 21st, 2011, they were one of the few services that actually survived the first massive, AZ availability zone failure in AWS. So yeah, I love what you just said, Rasmus.
I want to echo this too, because one of my favorite YouTube videos I used to send people who come from a world that wasn't tech that I used to know, and now I live in this tech world. They ask me sort of what that world's like. John Cleese did a really good take on this in the 80s. Have you seen it? Where he was speaking to a management sort of seminar thing. I believe it was in Polish, the version that I saw. It doesn't really matter, but he was talking about open mode and closed mode thinking. And closed mode thinking is what you're calling mode 2. And mode 2 is basically, once you know the idea, you shut off everything that's possible around you to distract you, and you just march towards. That's a sprint. That's agile. That's that style of agile. Let's call it that way. Open mode thinking, completely different. There's no wrong answer in open mode thinking. There's never, all you're trying to do is expand as many opportunities as you can. It turns out the Stanford Design School's method follows this pattern, right? These things have a lot of very good lineage across a number of different areas. It's true. But I agree with Rasmus. Slow is an interesting word in that context, but yeah.
Oh, and by the way, just to tell you kind of where my head went is, when you're in the fast moving production environment, you're in the middle of an outage, you have no idea what's going on, you're just trying to sense make, there's certain avenues of thinking that are not actually readily available to you, right? I mean, chances are you're in this fight flight mode. You're actually having to rely on a lot of routines and training and like previous experiences. It's actually not the best time, for one to actually, have a wide, expansive, ranging questions like, okay, what's the underlying causality that's actually happening here? Those are actually not modes of thinking that are available to you at that time. And there's actually, even for people who are really good at it, they're often not in the loop close enough, for the people in the middle of that situation to access. Like one example is in the Apollo 11. During the Apollo 11 landing, I was talking to the person who wrote the lunar landing software, who was so when the program fault codes, the 1201, 1202 errors came up, and apparently the Neil Armstrong actually lost all displays, of like, altitude, rate of descent, etc. There were all the people at the MIT labs, they were listening in it, but they were not in the loop. They were not able to actually contribute a lot of useful data for the landing that's happening, on the moon, millions of miles away. So open closed thinking, within our own brains, they're maybe not able to be accessed at the time, and there's all these expertise that we're not able to retrieve because it's either too far away temporally or spatially, where they can't actually directly contribute to the problem solving. Anyways, it's just fascinating.
No, I completely agree. And I have to say, as the child of an Army colonel, it was very interesting to see that your forward is about are from, the head of the Navy, and basically going, look, if I'd have read this, it'd have been so much easier to do my job. I mean, how much more of a promotion can you possibly get? It's like, oh, do you want to run a Navy? Well, yeah, hang out with Gene. He knows what's going on. It's great. One of the things, the reason why I bring up the John Cleese example is because one of the things that John Cleese talked about way back then was around setting the right environment for the different kinds of modes of thinking. And it's exactly as you were describing just a second ago. Your closed mode thinking, you need a very specific environment to enable and be successful. You need to be able to remove distractions. You need to be able to know that you're only focusing on one thing and there's the deadline, et cetera. In the world of, in the book, you definitely identify these three ifications. We've focused on one of them so far. You also talk quite a lot about the shape and the melding of an organization through this metaphor of circuitry. Now, circuitry triggered all sorts of thoughts in my head, some of them biological, some of them, I went quantum physics for a bit. It's like, okay, what is a circuit really? Like, what is the circuit really, Gene? Like, what do you mean? Because when you look up social circuitry in Wikipedia, what you get back is how a brain is wired to be social. I don't think that's what you're talking about. You're talking about the shape of an organization, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. In fact, so we said there's essentially three layers of where work is performed. Layer one is like the work in front of us. So that could be the code. That could be the binary that's actually running in production. It could be the patient in front of us. Layer two is the tools of which we work through. So it could be the platforms in which our code runs. It could be the IDE, right? And there's usually teams associated with supporting those technologies. And then layer three is what we're calling the social circuitry. It's the organizational wiring. And I love that Winston Churchill quote, we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us, right? As leaders, we create the social circuitry and thereafter it shapes us. We create the architecture that we work within and forever after it shapes us. And what we are saying is that leaders are ultimately responsible, for creating the wiring of which everyone works within. And so when we were talking about the Amazon API re-architecture in the early 2000s, they had found themselves in an architecture where it used to serve them well. They could do hundreds of deployments per year, when they had basically two products, books and music, and things got harder and harder to the point where they can only do tens of deployments a year. Most deployments didn't actually finish. And they were caught in this the social circuitry, this architecture that required even small things to require massive amounts of communication and coordination and signaling and prioritization and sequencing and deconfliction, and worst, you have to deploy together. And so even anything going wrong caused the deployment to abort. And so the whole magic of the two pizza team was, Jeff Bezos saying that he wanted less communication, not more. He wanted teams to be able to work independently of each other so they could be deployed towards Amazon's largest problems on behalf of customers. And that's actually what led to this hard partitioning between teams so that teams could regain independence of action, so that they could independently develop, deploy value to customers, without that need to communicate and coordinate. Sorry, if I could just make a little detour. I read there's a fantastic interview of then Amazon CTO Werner Vogel, still CTO. And he talked about that era. And I read that paper 20, 40 times. And I missed this one phrase until this earlier this year where he talked about this ridiculous situation that the Amazon digital team, so that's Kindle, music, video, where whenever you ordered one of those products, you still had to provide a physical shipping address. And he said, yeah, it was ridiculous, but they had to go to 60 different ordering teams and say, could you please change it so we wouldn't have to provide the physical shipping address? And the response was, we didn't budget for it. And so they were stuck, right? And so, that's what led to that famous memo about, teams shall only communicate and coordinate with each other through these APIs. And that was a rewiring of the organization. And so leaders rewire either through slowifying, so moving some activities from production to planning and preparation. They can change the nature of how we work so that they're more modular, they're more linear, or they're less large batch waterfallish, or we change the signal so that we create a system where even weak signals of failures are noticed and acted upon. Or the worst case is, we accidentally create a culture where weak signals are suppressed or even extinguished entirely, right? Which is obviously not so good.
That's a hilarious example that feels so relevant because I work with a client that's in the UK, and even if I have to put in a ticket to get access to a repository, I have to enter a shipping address. And since I'm in the US, the UK, I apparently live in Buckingham Palace when it comes to sending me things related to my repo request to GitHub. So there's so much fun stuff out there. And much like Neal pointed out, that case study with the Navy, or the intro, there are a lot of interesting case studies that you put in that book, and including a lot of older ones that probably hint at conceptual similarities in this problem space dating back probably like to the punch card era or even beyond that, because people are still people and the tech just changes. Like one thing we've done previously in this podcast, we talked about demystifying Kubernetes because Kubernetes is hard. And pretty much at the end of the session, we got to the conclusion, you know what? Kubernetes still is complex. You just kind of move the complexity around, and you have, instead of like having a guy that's just physically wiring things in a server room, you now have Kubernetes experts that's just digitally wiring virtual hardware. You haven't really changed it, but you have incidentally gained like a scaling benefit.
Yeah.
But the social change hasn't really been there. So that leaves me with a few questions for you. In that, do you think we're truly gaining any radical social benefits over time, or are we just solving the same problems over and over again with new tech and new terms?
Oh, that's a great question. So let me. One of the most shocking things. One of the things that was so fun working with Dr. Steve Spear was the fact that our backgrounds we come from totally different backgrounds. His work started studying Toyota and its production, famous production system. He wrote the 1999 Decoding the DNA of the Toyota Production System, which I read in the early 2000s. He worked in aviation, engine design, and plant safety at Alcoa. And my background is primarily software, and yet we had read so many of the same papers, and we had a common language, and it was so interesting. So I learned many things, but here's like one of the shocking things I learned only in the last 90 days. And he said that hospitals were actually very easy to manage in the 1950s compared to now, because essentially you had two functional specialties, doctors and nurses, and very little technology. Compare that to these days, where there are scores of functional specialties just within sort of the doctors, right? You have the even radiology, which used to be just X-rays, is now called imaging because it involves 5 different potential technologies, each with different teams, supporting them. Now there's pharmacy and supply chain and so forth, and it means, and it explains why it's so difficult to get great healthcare, because the number of functional specialties has gone up by somewhere between 40 and 100x. And so it introduces this, the big aha moment is the responsibility, the job that the layer 3 circuitry has to do was so much easier back in the 1950s, both in terms, because the functional specialties were fewer, there are fewer technology silos, compared to now. And I think what you're describing is, very similar to technology today, is that we have so many more functional specialties. I'll just name a couple, right? The security, authentication, authorization. You got database security. You have data masking. You have containers. You have Kubernetes. You have observability. You have all these things. These are all things I don't want to do. I would far rather, in fact, my worst Thanksgiving of last year, I spent one very unrewarding week learning about logging. It wasn't something I particularly wanted to learn, Java logging. It actually turned out to be somewhat important, and but it was something I finally had to learn. But did I really care about it? No. Did I get a lot of joy and reward learning about Java logging? No. But there was actually, was it important? Yes. Would I far rather have relied on like a group whose entire role in life was to solve logging for thousands of engineers? Yes. Is that available to solo developers? No. Anyway, so I think this is the fact that there's so many specialties. I think this is actually what allows, where being big is an inherent advantage, potentially an advantage, because it allows for these different specializations, right, that can empower and arm and uplift, thousands of other developers. And it's a shame, Rasmus, when we create these functional specialties when there's not even a problem, when it's not even relevant to the main problem being solved, right? We just now stood up another Kubernetes specialist group that makes it even more difficult for work to get out the door, right? With no actual benefit. I mean, that would be a shame if that were actually happening, right?
Yeah, this actually reminds me a bit about how I have interpreted the rise of platform engineering, because there should be a group that like focuses on logging, and then they expose, here are ways to do logging in part of some sort of platform, like an IDP, like Backstage and so on. But that's
Absolutely. Can I give you one example of like one of my favorite examples, right? I love platform engineering, love, how that's team topology articulates the need for it. But one of my most shocking examples of this was a small team of 5 to 8 engineers at Google, and they're called the Java platform team. And their goal was to be very good at Java, because it turns out the thousands of Google developers who are, have a decade's history with Java, even they struggle with the migration between Java 8 and Java 11, that it actually triggered, these out of memory errors because of the way that, garbage collection was different in, G1, GC. Anyway, the point is that as teams migrated to Java 11 and the new version of JVM, the rate of container out of memory errors went through the roof. And it turns out that one of the reasons is that the developer instinct is to just ask for more memory, and it still caused errors, which caused them to increase more memory. So you had these services in production that were using wildly more memory than they should. And so this team figured out, all right, how do we how do we fix this for developers? But they actually had a longer term goal of making it so that services spend more time in garbage collection, because the most scarce and most expensive commodity at Google is not compute, is memory. And so they showed these experiments where you could get Google services running in 1/10 the memory, right, saving tens of millions of dollars, right? And this is just in the pilot. Anyway, just so great that small teams can have incredible benefits, for thousands of engineers, and impacting tens of millions of dollars, potentially heading to hundreds of millions of dollars.
And you would call that small team of Java, let's call them zealots, let's call them aficionados, maybe aficionados, that's probably better. You'd call them a slowification team, right? Because really they're not in the day-to-day drags of, I'm migrating this version of this JVM on this day. They're going, how does one think about JVMs in the first place? What is the, I got it.
Yeah, exactly. And their product is taking advantage of modularization, right? So that for the developers, their world didn't change at all, right? Their interface to the outside world didn't change at all, and yet they gain all the benefits of what the small team is doing, in terms of memory usage, cost, power consumption, etc.
Yeah, we know these problems all too well. Building a JVM product on top of a JVM, right? That's a very common trope, I think. But
when you talk about wiring the organization as such, will these small teams be the bottleneck, right? I mean, will they be the single point of failure? That is always the concern, isn't it? And how do you scale this to a much, much wider organization?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think what is amazing about these platform teams is because everything is either self-service, right? So that they can't become the bottleneck, because everything is on demand. You don't have to open up a ticket. You don't have to pester them for weeks. You can get what you need. I can get the logging to go where it needs to. I can scrub all the data, without waiting for someone to actually, work on my ticket. That's how these amazing platform teams in cloud have, enabled so much developer productivity. But there's another thing that platform teams do, which is that they work behind these fixed interfaces so that they can experiment independent of someone else. In other words, if every time this Java platform team at Google wanted to potentially change a setting, they had to communicate and coordinate with 1,000 of other developers, at Google. And if any one of them said, "Oh no, not right now, I'm working on something very critical," then they would be stuck, right? And yet, what happens instead is that just with any good modular system, teams can, behind this interface, they can change independently, they can experiment, they can search a large exploration space, right? And it's like you now have 100 roulette wheels that you can spin. And if any of them hit, then you can sort of shift that in and take the winnings, right? And if they don't hit, you don't change anything at all, right? So you take the wins and you ignore the losses. And I think that was this fascinating way that economists talk about the benefits of modularity. So to your point, right? You know you're doing something wrong when a platform team inadvertently creates a bottleneck. I think it's either because they violated self-service or they haven't created a hard partition, between them and the rest of the world. How am I doing?
That's
Pretty good.
absolutely great. Yeah, I think we are doing really great.
Yep.
Fascinating chat.
So this is still feels a lot like talking tech. There's a lot of helpfulness to people in that here's platforms, here interfaces to teams, here are good things, and so on. I'm also wondering, what can we do at a tech level to encourage improvements to the social circuitry of an organization? So for instance, we're working on this DevOps product that's, platform engineering, of course, because everybody's doing platform engineering. And I've been leading up some of the design elements for it. And I have tried we need tools. Tools are over here. They're fine. We know that. That's not like novel. Everybody's doing tools. We know platform engineering and so on. But we want to do some focus on the people and process bits of the DevOps triad. But how do we do that? How do we support that inside a product? And so far, I've mostly focused on really, really emphasizing relationships between things. So you can find the groups and you can know about how they interact and how they're doing over time. And so you can raise visibility, amplification on these teams are struggling in some ways. So let's help them. But it's still just about making more visibility and so on.
Huh.
What can you think of that would help tech support the improvement of social circuitry?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And in fact, it's so good. I wish we had put this into the book, but let's see if we can sort of survey the landscape. I mean, if let's just go through each one of the principles and let's see if we can tease out what they must be. So with slowification, right, I think the failure mode that would emerge is everyone knows that this is like the best thing, since sliced bread. Everyone should be using it, but there's no time in the individual team schedule to actually adopt it, right? There's the pressure to ship features is so great, that we can't make this short-term investment, even though there's a longer-term gain, right? So that's clearly a need for leadership to help slowify, to get groups to get from here to there. I think that's definitely one. And simplification, right? One failure mode would be like shift everybody all at once, right? And that's probably bad because we've now forced every group to take on a bunch of novelty, and we can't learn from lessons learned of the previous group, right? So we've sort of inadvertently pushed everything to do it all at once, when probably a better approach would be something staged, right? Let's take the people who really want to do this, who see the benefits, right, and then use that as a stepping stone, for wider spread adoption.
I just had a thing that hit me, because you put some neat diagrams in where you show the danger zone and the good one, and map things. I wonder if you could do live maps like that in a platform.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, it's actually what I'm doing right now is actually walking through kind of in each phase what are the sort of the danger zone, winning zone characteristics. Yeah. So, and so I'll sort of I'll continue to think out loud and sort of explicitly name those. That's a great point, Rasmus. So another a definite failure mode would be around modularization, right? So. The fact that you have a platform capability, the goal would be to, once you're on the platform, you can hide more of the world to the users. I mean, I think one of the amazing things about Google was Google Borg. And so one of the surprising things about Google Borg is that it was considered such a competitive advantage that there was no outside mention of it written down until about 2013. So it ran over a decade in production. And so what is Google Borg? It was the predecessor is what Kubernetes is modeled upon. It used to be it's called the cluster manager. So actually Google Kubernetes engine actually runs on Google Borg. Most core services run on Google Borg. And what was so the difference it made to Google engineers is that you could write code as if, so you didn't have to worry about what happens when your server just disappears. You didn't have to worry about like which data center you're running on, right? So all the things that we take advantage of and take for granted in Kubernetes. So it allowed developers to focus on, the business functionality, right? Not about resilience, not about observability, not about hardening against resilience failures. And so what's marvelous about platforms is that once you're running on the platform, a whole bunch of other problems are taken care of for you, and you don't need to worry about them. So, I think that's probably and it creates independence of action, right? The platform can improve independent of the teams that are running on that platform. So what's the danger zone there, right? Is somehow that dependencies leak out, the abstraction leaks out, so that suddenly developers now do have to worry about Java logging, configuration settings, when ideally that should be hidden from them. Arguably, linearization is when you have dependent activities that should happen sequentially, and things get intertangled between them, right? And so the beauty of CI/CD is that not only is it automated, but the build engineers are now going to have independence of action from the QA engineers and the deployment engineers. And so we know that independence of action liberates lots of creativity and abilities to solve problems independently of each other, right? The opposite of that is what in the bad old days, 10, 15 years ago, where you have these huge Gantt charts of 1,300 activities that all must happen sequentially, and if anything goes wrong, right, the entire thing might blow up. And then amplification is what's the danger zone activities there? Oh yeah, right. Things go wrong in the system, and the signals don't go to where they need to go, and they're either so weak or faint that it might get transmitted but never gets received. And if I can just add one story that I just love in the book is the Southwest Airlines holiday failure. When this was unfolding, and this was about 1 year ago, Admiral John Richardson and Steven Spear and I were texting for almost a week because it was this incredible example of signals not getting to where they needed to go, right? So, when Winter Storm Elliott hit, there were nearly 10,000 flight cancellations. And what was remarkable, though, was that most airlines could recover in a couple of days. What happened at Southwest Airlines is that the number of cancellations kept increasing. And the reason why was their crew scheduling system. So as widely was reported, what happened when Southwest Airlines at the end of each day, if they were not in the city they were supposed to be in, they had to call like a special number in the crew scheduling office. And they had hold times of, half hour, hours, sometimes scores of hours. So if that information didn't get factored into the schedule, when the next day the planes weren't where they thought the scheduling system would be, right? And so they had to cancel the flight. And so ultimately what they had to do was essentially reboot the airline network, right, just to fly these empty planes to where they need to be to resume normal operations. And so this was such a great example of where the control overlay, the layer 3 social circuitry, could not transmit information effectively enough to where it needed to go to the people at the edge. So I thought this is such a great example of control theory in action happening in a space where you could actually see the consequences, right? And where the information was actually being transmitted by telephone, right, into crew scheduling systems. Anyway, how am I doing?
Makes perfect sense. The question of like level 1, level 2, level 3 is a really interesting interplay, because you're right. Just as the social circuitry is built on those relationships and those interconnected coupling and loosely coupling, as you define in the book, and yeah, that's really good. The reality is, though, I think in the case of Southwest, that's a really good example. We see examples like this all the time of customers who are dealing with the issue of, I don't have the right environment to be in that winning sphere. And there's only so many levers I can pull really quickly. One of the levers I can pull is I can swap out GitHub for GitLab, right? I can do these kinds of, okay, cool, everyone's now on this thing. But as Rasmus was asking about, and I think I agree, The issue really is in that relationship between level 2 and 3. It seems to me, with the customers we talk to and the way that we work and the way we operate with them, there are things that can happen at level 2 that are almost those pre-ordered conditions, those things that actually enable just the very basics. So you're talking about amplification. Amplification, getting something to the right person at the right time, is kind of a tiny bit of automation. If you're looking at it in that level 2 sense, right? Tiny bit of automation, but it's also quite a lot of, actually, you really need to know a bit more about who you're dealing with. You need to know a bit more about the team. You need to know a bit more about what they're working on. Otherwise, everyone is just getting blasted with, hey, somebody uploaded something to the board. Oh God, I can't even imagine the notification queue. You know what I mean?
Yeah. In fact, so one of the things I'm hoping people will really remember out of the book is the story of Steve and Gene moving a couch. And the story goes, Steve and Gene need to move a couch, and you would think that this is all Ron work, no brain work allowed. And it turns out that there's actually a ton of problems that they need to solve, like where's the center of gravity, to get through a narrow doorway, around which axis do they need to rotate, to get down a narrow winding set of stairs, who should go first, and do they face forwards or backwards? And what's remarkable is that, they don't need a bunch of consultants. They don't need focus groups, right? Just by picking up the couch through trial and error, fast feedback, right, and communication coordination, they will probably figure out how to solve the problem. But there's all these things that leaders can do to make it very difficult for Steve and Gene to do their work. They can turn off all the lights, right, which is, makes the work more dangerous. It will take longer. People could get hurt. Furniture could get damaged. We could also introduce a lot of background noise, like a siren, like a loud music, which makes the problem more difficult, but in a way different than just turning off the lights. We could introduce an intermediary that prevents Steve and Gene from talking directly with each other. We can make them go through JIRA tickets. We can make them go through work orders with lawyers involved, account managers, right? And what's remarkable is that this too will make it very difficult for Steve and Gene to do their work. And so moving a couch is a metaphor for joint cognition and joint problem solving. And so what you were saying, Neal, is that often the best thing that we can do is embed someone from the platform engineering group into the dev team, because the developers may not have the language to be able to describe what they need, right? And so the best thing that we can do is to actually have a platform engineering expert observe their work, right? To deeply understand the problem, to help them on board, or to better yet, maybe if there's something that the platform can't do, build it for them, because these platform engineers are so expert that they can understand what needs to be done, even though the customer can't even articulate what their problems are, right? And so I was mentioning to somebody, I actually saw properly formed Kubernetes deployment file, and it was so shocking to me, and it made me realize I don't even know what correct YAML looks like. So, and this is not where I want to be spending my time. And so, if I can just add one more thing on that. So, whenever you have people moving a couch, it means that they're inherently coupled together. What affects the couch affects Steve and Gene. What affects Gene affects Steve, and vice versa. And so sometimes that coupling is inherent in the problem. Dev and ops. It turns out that that was a problem. So there were so many problems to be solved, and the information that needed to be transferred was so great that dev and ops have to be coupled together, right? Microservices represents where you don't actually need a lot of communication and coordination. And my favorite example of this was the Apollo Capcoms. It turns out during the Apollo space program, for the crew in space, it turns out there were only about 10 people on the ground who were allowed to communicate with them. They were called the Capcoms, and they were astronauts. And they were not just any astronauts. They were either the people who trained the astronauts in space, or they were the backup crew. And so when you have an emergency in space, it turns out the bandwidth is so finite, and the need to communicate and coordinate is so critical that you actually need an astronaut on both sides of the channel, right? Because as what Alan Kay once said, when a message is so important, don't send a message, you must send a messenger, right? And so it just says when moving a couch, sometimes the best thing you can do is actually own both sides of the couch, right? So that you can get maximum information through that sparse channel.
This is a great example, right? I mean, as I said before, we look at transforming organizations, and one of the things that we try to train people on is don't look at it just the solution, look at also the problem, right? And people come to us and ask, hey, I'm Stephen G and I need help moving this couch. Now take a pause and ask, okay, why are you actually moving the couch? Okay, we can definitely help you move the couch. We have all the tools and the people to move the couch, but why are you actually trying to move the couch? That probably might tell you an answer where you don't have to actually move the couch. There may be a better solution out there, right?
Yeah.
It's also why is moving the couch hard? I love that question. Our CTO, John, who couldn't make it with us on this episode, but will be in a future one. This is a question he asks all the time. It's like, what about this conversation is hard, right? Okay, there's a couch. Couch moving is something most people can do. What's going on here? But Gene, it's not going to surprise you. We're one of these groups that's unique. And I in other podcast episodes, we've talked about this, about our structure and how we operate. Rasmus and I are giggling behind the scenes as you're talking about this, because this relationship in our group, we actually have those project managers. We even have legal involved sometimes when we're working together in contracts. And the reason why we can do that is because of our consultative background, because of the growth that we've had in our product businesses, we're actually pretty good at writing a minimum viable contract. And I truly mean writing on a piece of paper like a minimum viable. And actually right now, my customer in the room is Rasmus. So in between our business units, the way we're operating, we actually have these internal contracts and statements of work. And the reason why we do this is we codify the way of working into the contract. And in some cases, what you need is, you need staff augmentation. You need someone dedicated in your team doing what you do, whatever. Sometimes they go, or your customer, internal or external, might go, you know what? I don't need the people. I really just don't care about Java logging. I really don't want to care about this. I never do. Cool. We've got an app that solves that. And I was laughing as you were telling us. One of the groups working with us right now has solved that logging problem 4 different ways. One's a consultancy, one's a managed service, one's a product, and one's an SDK, right? And in each one of these areas, depending on how you want to not think about Java logging, exactly. Do that. But it's one of those very good, you've got a lot of really good examples. Rasmus, we were talking about the Reno example, right? Mm-hmm. Is that the one? Yeah.
Yes, I'm a big fan of the hotel renovation example in there.
Oh,
yeah. The
couch movement. And especially because I could see myself in there, which leads to a question. Because for me, I also wonder when I'm looking at the book, great book, new perspective, new terms, love it. Who is it for? And I'll put myself into the example for that, because I feel like sometimes I'm a little bit of a weirdo nobody. I don't have reports.
Same here, by the way.
I don't have an area of authority. I post things on Slack and nobody listens. So can I do anything with this book other than just throw it at people and try to hit them or get them to read it? But then I put myself in that example. It's like I am standing outside the hotel and I'm seeing all these movers and painters run all over the place, and they're flying out the window. And there are these 2 dudes trying to organize it, and they're getting places. They finally figure out some things. But then I'm like, I can see something. I have an idea. I think it'll help. But I'm out here. I'm a nobody. How can I help? How can I be in the picture?
Yeah. By the way, one of my favorite descriptions of the Phoenix Project was exactly that use case. As he would throw the book, and I think he said he had a special version with serrated edges, right? That he would throw the book at people. I think that was definitely metaphorical and figurative. But you get to, I think, the most important question that anyone writing a book should be asking from the very beginning is who is the book for? And we specifically targeted the book at the boss of the technology leader. So I've been one of my areas of passion for the last 10 years has been studying, what we've called the DevOps enterprise community. And so we've had 19 conferences, over 1,100 experience reports, 1,500 leaders. And the goal is to really chronicle the transformations of, technology leaders in large complex organizations. And we recently renamed it the Enterprise Technology Leadership Summit because a lot of people were saying, why would I want to go to a deployment pipeline conference? It's like, oh, that's not what where DevOps was meant to connote, back in 2009. Anyway, so the observation is, I would say twofold. One is that the people driving these kind of DevOps transformations where they're trying to break down silos to better create value to help win in the marketplace, they're being they were being promoted at a rate far higher than the rest of the population. This is both for the quote managers and individual contributors. But it's been my observation that even those people, their fates were heavily reliant on who their boss was, and if that boss changed, it could go from great to not so great in a heartbeat. And it just said to me that the technology function is so often misunderstood. And so Steve has his own goals, but my goal was really, how do we show things like platform engineering, team topologies, breaking down silos. These are important for every organization, and it can be made explainable not just to that technology leader's boss, but we can explain it in a way that will resonate in their own experiences. Which one of the things I'm proud of, and that many people will find surprising, is that of the 25 case studies, only less than a quarter of them are technology related. So I think the benefit of that is, and the examples that we bring up are, Steve's experience bringing his daughter into an emergency room for a broken wrist, and finding that, oh my gosh, they had to wait in hours in the waiting room. The X-ray was initially was going to be taken on the wrong arm because of the incorrect documentation or unreadable documentation. The cast was instead of fiberglass, it's very kid friendly. It was actually a plaster cast, because of a breakdown in the communication with supply chain. To make the follow up appointment actually required them calling an outside line and to a number that no one actually knew. It's just, so all these things were indicative of inadequate layer 3 social circuitry. And it turns out, these problems can be found in any engineering and any organization doing significant things. So I would say that the choice of the forward from Admiral John Richardson, former Chief of Naval Operations for the entire U.S. Navy, he's on the board of Boeing. He has to oversee the performance of CEOs and highly consequential organizations. The goal was to aim for the people that he interacts with, the people that are, the technology leader's boss has to interact with, to make it relevant to them, not just something, bespoke to technology, but no, this is something that is universal to the way organizations work. So, Rasmus, my hope is that this enables that use case to say, hey, look, there's something really bad happening here because we're not solidifying, we're not modularizing, we're not linearizing, we're not amplifying. Here's a book that explains why it's important, what it is, and how it's relevant to us, and provides some prescription that I think any technology leader, that means leaders at all levels, internal and external, we can use to help drive a business case for things that we need to do to get from here to there.
So you're telling me that I don't need to get a book with serrated edges and throw it at people to knock him out, take his job, and then tell people that. I can actually make it otherwise.
I love this. Gene, I have to tell you, you've reminded me from a story of my past, and I've never told this story as a breakdown in level 3 social circuitry, but I'm going to start this story in a way that most people in the UK where I live now won't be able to really recognize. I was held up at gunpoint in Oakland, California. It's a long story. Story. We'll shorten this story to say this was the year that Find My iPhone came out for the dev people, so people had access to Apple developer community, right? I had enabled that on an iPad, and I had just bought a little 4G device, which used to be huge, right? I'm given my age, but I was robbed at gunpoint. They stole the iPad and they stole the 4G device, stole the whole bag. I'm at my house, and the Oakland Police Department, who at the time was pretty infamous for not being really great. They're much better now, but at the time they were having some trouble. They luckily asked the question because it's Silicon Valley. They said, do you have anything in your bag that can be tracked? I went, aha, level 2, aha, I have enabled the tool. Fine. Turns out it was on Highway 280. So they say, get in the back of the car. So I'm riding around in the back of the car, find my iPhone. I'm hoping it works. This is my trust in Apple that the developer community was there. Turns out it did. We get to a pizza place. It's a long story near Fruitvale, and sure enough, we find the car. We find the bag. In fact, it was the 14th thing that had gotten stolen that day, including the car. Level 2 on the game. Now, here's the problem with level 3. I identified 2 types of police officers that day. There's the police officers who were level 3 engaged. They had their social circuitry switched on, or they were ready to accept social circuitry. They came to me and they asked the question, how did you do this? Because this is unique. How did this happen? And I explained, well, find my iPhone. If anybody in the next month says they've turned this on, this is a thing that you all can use. This is incredible. Sans one of them, won't name them, don't know their name really, said, hang on, what you mean? You can track any iPhone. No. It's only yours. You turn on for your family, blah, blah, blah. So you're saying my spouse can track my phone. Okay. Breakdown. Social circuitry. Sorry, you're not getting it. Yeah. And you could see the divide. There was a gap, and it wasn't an age gap. It wasn't a gender gap. It wasn't anything like that. It was just there are people who were looking at that level 2, the increase in the technology as a capability that they could use, and possibly you might call in some cases surveil. In this case, I had approval to be surveilled. Thank you very much. It helped me out. But right, it's just one of these very interesting things. You're right. These are technology problems for sure. And people who are operating in technology organizations or enabled organizations, they have these problems more than most. But this is a problem even if with petty crime. Yeah. This is a problem with, theft on the street, one might argue.
And I'll just resonate with that story. And so in adoption, we're always looking for these early adopters who are not just have a desire and a knack for finding promising technologies to solve the next kind of horizon of problems, but they're also trusted. They're vocal. People view them as the early adopters. So do you want to use this new platform? No, I'll wait to see what Neal's experiences are, because we trust his judgment. Now, so whoever these mavens are, whoever he or she may be, right? They serve a very important function because they are judgmental. They're critical. Ideally, they have the best long-term interests of the organization at heart, right? They're not doing it just for technology's sake, but they're doing it because they have a sense of how people should be working, right? What problems shouldn't they be working on? Like Java logging, important, but not something that should be an area of expertise for thousands of engineers. In fact, can I just tell you a brief story of some patterns I love around platform adoption? I'll tell you 3 of them, because one of them you were just reminding me of. There was a presentation at the DevOps Enterprise Summit 2015. It was Ralph Laura, CIO of HP. This was before the split up. And he said kind of the role of shared services, we view them as buoys, not boundaries. So the metaphor he was using was like in a river channel, right? You stay within the buoys, you're going to be safe. They're dredged, they're highly maintained. But if you need to stray beyond the buoys, right, you have to make a business case for it. You have to follow the same principles that we do, around security, compliance, and so forth. But we encourage you to do that, because that might be the next, that innovation might be the next thing that we have to take into, within the buoys. I thought that was great. And I think directionally was just such a beautiful aha moment for what leaders needed to be doing in terms of setting norms around innovation. The second case study was Target 2017. And so for those in the UK, Target is the 6th largest retailer in the US. And, it's one of the organizations I've studied the most over the last decade. And so they famously outsourced almost all of their technology folks. That's thousands of engineers. And 2013, they started bringing them back in. And the seminal moment was when Ross Clanton, director of development. Actually, I think he was director of architecture and operations. He was formerly security. He said his aha moment was when they had to make a schema change to their data warehouse, and the estimates came back at 10,000 hours and $1 million, because it was spread between 3 different outsourcers. And he said that should be 15 minutes of work. What are we doing wrong? Anyway, so they to atone for their policy errors. They wanted every development team to be able to choose the technologies they used to help atone for decades of not allowing them to do that. So in 2017, Levi Gaynor, the director of engineering, he described this problem they had, which was that they had allowed so many technologies to come into the organization that developers could no longer switch teams easily because they're all using different technology stacks. And so what did they do about it? He described a quarterly meeting that they had with their CIO at the time, Mike McNamara, and they published 3 lists as their kind of new mechanism of governance. And it was just amazing. It said, first category, everything lived on a GitHub repo. The first category was, here's a technology that we love, and here's all the groups using it. Second technology group was, we're not sure yet, but here's all the groups using it. So if you want to know the goods and bads, just ask them. Third is do not use. We have active projects to deprecate this middleware database. Right? Don't make a new one, which we then have to then eradicate from the enterprise. So I love that because it was just so different than what I've seen lead architecture review boards do for generations. So the third one came from Comcast. So they own Sky in the UK. They own Universal Pictures, the largest broadband provider in the US, about 8,000 engineers. And they said, we want every engineer, every technologist to be innovating all the time, but not in certain areas. They said, especially not in CI/CD pipelines, because we've already got 14 of them in use, right? We should have 1 or maybe 2. And they described this process they went through where it wasn't really a popularity contest. It wasn't like, they settled. So they wanted to choose a technology that they rated from 1 to 5. And the goal wasn't to pick the technology with the most number of number ones. It was like, who had the most number of answers of 3 or better? 3 meaning I could support it if. And what was remarkable was Jonathan Moore, one of the presenters, he was the chief software architect. He said, it was amazing that we could get to a set of technologies, even though there was no short-term gain from any of the development groups. But everyone saw that there was a long-term gain. And it was actually caused by an outage that happened because a certain team was using a CI/CD platform that didn't understand very well, that wasn't really well supported in the organization. And so the goal was, let's pick 1 or 2 that we could get really, really good at, and then create a transition plan where we could move thousands of teams onto these 1 or 2 platforms. Anyway, so they seem mutually contradictory, and yet I think all of them are made with the same sort of intent. Right? How do we enable teams to do what they do best, right? And enable them and lift the tide that lifts all boats.
Absolutely great. The rising tide lift all boats metaphor is a really interesting one. And it's interesting in that context of the buoys, because you're right. We actually, this is our stated CTO strategy for us. And this is how we approach our consultancy, our products, and everything else that we do. But those shared services are our guideposts, and they should be the center of gravity of where everyone probably needs to go. However, when they're not, and when they're not fit for purpose, every group that we've got has the autonomy to decide a different path or an amended path or recompose some of these services together to bring out something that's more fit for purpose and commit it back to the core. To go, actually, we like this way. We just swapped our identity providers. We were an Auth0 shop for most of our customer-facing things. I think I saw you giggling about this on Twitter about Auth0 and ChatGPT, right? Like, how? Oh my God, what is the bill? Yeah, we had that at a much smaller level, right? So we shifted to these guys called Clerk, which are doing really great. But what came very quickly was their dev experience was so good. We took it and we put those buoys out and went, everybody, the runway is a lot shorter than we thought to getting out of that innovation, early adopter phase. This is actually fit for purpose. What do we need to do to scale this? What do we need to do to enable others to get the same successes that some of these other groups got? It's this kind of shifting of the organization across different groups, right?
And what a brilliant property of modularization. The fact that you could switch authentication providers without impacting all of your customers, right? And having them you can make all your changes on your side of the interface without affecting them. Absolutely marvelous. By the way, Rasmus, it just occurred to me while Neal was talking. So another tool that one could use, right, to kind of reshape or create signals to trigger reshaping the layer 3 social circuitry is Net Promoter Score. So one of my favorite tools that is used within the technology leadership community is employee Net Promoter Score and Net Promoter Scores. Is like everyone competes in an internal marketplace. Very few organizations these days say you must use this, and there are no ability to choose the competition. And I think the modern reality is whenever you're, especially for platforms, you're competing against other platforms. And so how do you measure that? One is Net Promoter Score. And this is a simple question. On a scale of 1 to 10, to what degree would you recommend this to a colleague or friend? And the secret is, I think the answer is goes from negative 100 to 100. And you're only really counting the 9s and 10s. And great scores are like 60 and above. Certain shared services, I learned one group, it was for an SAP security role administrator change. They had an SLA of being able to make changes in 2 weeks. They averaged about 2.5 months. They had a Net Promoter Score of negative 87, which is actually the lowest I've ever heard of. I knew they could go negative. I didn't know they could go to negative 100. At any rate, this amazing technology leader said, we love shared services, but not here. They actually broke up the team. They put those SAP security experts into the business units. And, now it's like at, plus 40, which just shows same people, same equipment. The only thing that changed is the wiring, right? And just shows how the difference maker so often is in that layer 3 social circuitry.
Well, if you want to throw some more concepts and things I can put in my platform or need a new co-author for the next book, let me know.
And by the way, what a great example of those, and it explains why great platforms, great SaaS products often have a little pop-up box to say, not only can I help, but on a 1 to 10, how likely would you be to recommend this service to your friend, right? It's actually a powerful signal of, to what extent people love using your platform.
We actually combine so we use NPS all over the place. Internally, it's not as used as it is external, but we're one of the few groups that we know in our space that actually do it on every consultative arrangement too. Which is, if you like the relationship you've had with us, and most importantly, it's not just the people that you got, our brand, what your expectations are, but it's also, was the mode of operation what you expected? Were you sold what you were actually delivered? Like every one of those subtle promoter questions, and they're not always using NPS, they're sometimes using a different variant, but yeah. That feedback loop, super important. And it also, internally, we see this in our group. It's predicated on the idea that you're the customer and that shared service is a vendor. And as long as you have those expectations, you put those hats on and you have that relationship, and at the end of the day, you're going to be providing a Net Promoter Score to this group and how they are giving you feedback, you're in the driver's seat. You can ask for what you want. And someone may not take your contract. We've had some situations that happens too, right? Which is going, well, I need this mode of operation. Cool, this group can't do that. We need to find a different way, right? This isn't going to be the way that we operate. Totally fine if you've got that. I don't know if you've come across the boundaryless guys. Simone has that podcast, which is really good. They preach composable business. Yeah, this is one of the big tenets of how we operate. We love those guys. The boundaryless kids are really fun. But this is definitely part of our DNA, how we operate.
If I can just riff on that just briefly.
Sure.
So one of the core theses one of the theses that one of the things that we really built the book on was, the job of leaders is to make it so that the people that they support can do their work easily and well. And, the work that I helped contribute, one of the things I was so proud of to work on was the state of DevOps research with Dr. Nicole Forsgren and Jez Humble, from 2013 to 2019. And that's when I really got introduced to the employee Net Promoter Score, the notion that, instead of our products, would you recommend your team as a great place to work to your colleagues and friends? And it's such a great signal that says, is it, I think you can start tracing the dots of what makes it so that you would want to recommend your job to someone you care about, to a colleague or friend. If it requires heroics to even get small things done, if everything It requires tons of communication, coordination, and authorization, and synchronization, and deconfliction, and blah, 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 right? That's not a fun place to work. You can see this in developer experience, but I think it's true for anything in general. If you don't have enough time allocated for solidification and all your work is horrendous, difficult, dangerous, scary, these are not great working conditions, and leaders are responsible for creating those conditions. And so I would just encourage any leader to say, all right, maybe a very important signal that I need is not just telemetry around my product, but that basic telemetry of, are people happy? Do people like being on this team? One of the things I learned from the Dr. Jennifer Pedoff, who's until recently was based in Ireland, a director of SRE at Google. I asked her, how are directors of SRE measured? Right, it's not, can't be based on the success of the products they support, right? She said one of the dominant measures are, to what degree are the SREs working underneath them happy? How satisfied are they that they can do their job well? And that was just such a terrific validation of this notion, of the job of leaders.
It's just funny that you mentioned Google just recently announced the DORA metrics doesn't necessarily cover that, the happiness, the measure of happiness, the burnout, those kind of things, because the four core DORA metrics, they focus on time to market and things like that. Doesn't really cover, is Rasmus happy or is Jobin happy?
But the key finding was that those technical measures also correlate with organizational performance, which include to what degree are we exceeding profitability, market share, and productivity goals, and we know that it also influences employee net promoter score. Those high performers were twice as likely, people were twice as likely to recommend their organizations as a great place to work. And by the way, just a little trivia fact, where did that employee net promoter score come from? It actually came from a guy named Dr. Andre Martin, who was later VP of People Dev at Google. And he just came out with a great book called Right Fit, Wrong Fit. Anyway, just that actually came from a series of text messages in 2015 or 2016. And it was like, oh my gosh, Nicole, like I have a great question. Like we've been searching for like this culture score. There's something called the Gallup 13, but we can't ask 13 questions. So it turns out the employee net promoter score is this incredible sort of collapse of that one question of this engagement questions that are often used in HR circles.
Do you know where I'd love to ask what the net promoter score is? It's in a company called Parts Unlimited. I'm just wondering, as we kind of start to wrap up, I think back to Brent in Parts Unlimited, Maxine in the Unicorn Project, very, very unhappy developers, whoever they are. And now we're talking about rewiring organizations with social circuitry. Do you think, as an industry, if you look at the period between like the Phoenix Project, the Unicorn Project, coming on to the latest book, are we actually getting there? Are we speaking to the same people with the new book, or the NPS score is just going to be terrible forever? What do you think?
Oh, in fact, it's funny. In the Unicorn Project, they actually do a net promoter score, and within the businesses, within the store managers, right, with the right store manager, it was world class. I think it was like 50 plus. And then they asked, what is it for IT? And I would think it was negative 14. But I think the story ends where the technologists were some of the most switched on people in the group, where that they were attracting the best talent, not just from technology, but also from, quote, the business. So I think if the question is, are we making any progress? And I have to say, the answer from my perspective is, undisputably yes. Having chronicled the technology leadership journey for the last 10 years across 1,100 plus experience reports, there's just no doubt in my mind, that increasingly business leadership recognizes that the technology organization is a critical competency to win in the marketplace. And they might, it's not 100%, but it's so much larger than it was before. And so I credit, those incredible technology leaders who helped pioneer, these practices that were typically only associated with the tech giants, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Microsoft, and showing that, hey, it's relevant for everybody. I mean, I just am so grateful for the ability to help chronicle those journeys, because I think it affects all of us.
You're exactly right. And Gartner refers to those giants you're referring to as the digital dragons, and I love this sort of ostentatiousness of that idea. But I have to say, to sort of round out and sort of to drop your last questions, it's a breath of fresh air. It feels so good to have an entire podcast where we didn't say ChatGPT once, but I broke the seal. So all of this is great, and as you're writing your book, I'm sure none of this has come out yet. Where are you at with this? Like, how are you looking at this new technology? Because no one yet is saying, "Oh, this is killing DevOps." They're talking about industries that are changing quite drastically with these new generative capabilities coming in. Have you been playing with this recently? Like, what's been the plan, man?
It has been so fun. I got to tell you, I haven't had this much fun in technology in 20 plus years. It's so radically different. It's not deterministic. It's amazing. I'll tell you one thing that I've been having just a ton of fun doing that's been just a huge eye opener for me is I'm publishing this new video podcast called Thinking Out Loud. So it's kind of a little extension on the Idealcast podcast that I've done for several years. And so it's just a little easier lift than the Idealcast podcast episodes. So one of the things that I did was use ChatGPT to confirm some things that I actually wanted to do during the writing, but only have had a chance to do now that the book's out. One of them was, I gave ChatGPT, GPT-4, the couch analogy, and then asked it, can you validate and explain to me how the couch metaphor can simultaneously explain the Amazon re-architecture of the early 2000s. And it said, yes, absolutely. Amazon 2001 was 3,500-ish engineers all coupled to one couch. So in order for any of them to get anything done, they had to coordinate with 3,500 other engineers. And so they split it up into microservices, right, into smaller couches, right, to regain independence of action. I'm like, awesome. All right, now here's the Amazon Prime Video example. Please explain to me, using the couch as a metaphor, what that is. Like, oh, exactly. It was like they had split the couches into too many little tiny fragments, so that too much of the effort was in coordination and transport, copying these video files in and out of storage buckets. I'm like, yes, exactly. So the countermeasure was glue the couches back together into one monolith, so that they could all be recreate coherence. I just love that, because I think the mark of a good model is that it can explain the most with the least. And I'm just amazed at how good ChatGPT is, not at just summarization, but making these kind of inferences and taking metaphors, and for me, just using it to help sort of concretize and validate my own thinking. Man, it's just so fun. And for the technology leadership community, we spent the first part of this interview talking about like how much harder life is when there are more functional specialties. Oh man, with generative AI, just add one more functional specialty to the left, right? You got all the data and AI engineers on the left, and Dev has to go meet them there. And we also have to push them further to the right in production. I mean, that is as if our job weren't difficult enough. We've just added one more thing that the layer 3 social circuitry has to do, which is integrate this whole bunch of people who don't look like your typical engineer and integrate them into the value stream and introduce a whole bunch of risks that we've never had to deal with in production, right? I think it's a phenomenal frontier, and it just shows that what worked for us one year may not be enough to work the next year. It's a great time to be in the game.
And adaptation is key, isn't it? Right? Because your way of building content last year is not the way you need to protect yourself from content that's created this year. I agree with you. The landscape is vast, and the cliffs are buried. You don't know. You don't know where those black holes lie. Right? It's fascinating too. The mathematics behind them. You're right about ChatGPT. ChatGPT as an interface is one thing. GPT-4 as the underlying technology is another. We're seeing organizations looking at Mistral and even Facebook's Llama, right? Looking at how these things compare against each other, because depending on what task you're doing and depending on what guidance you're giving it and things like this, what supporting material makes its way in, how you're cutting your sentences apart, it's just a whole new world that, frankly, we're looking at it exactly the same way, going, this is really exciting. It's a really exciting time to be in tech.
It is.
This is probably a whole other podcast.
This is it. Honestly, you could talk all day on this, couldn't you?
And I have to say, it's in the Enterprise Technology Leadership Summit for the last year, we've had like about 20 to 30% of talks on generative AI, and it's just so exciting to see how much energy it just injects into the conference, because it dazzles us, it tells us what's possible, it excites us in terms of like what we can do for our organization, and it's also the next frontier that technology leadership probably invariably has to tackle.
But as we tackle that, people will always be there.
Oh.
And so that's what I appreciate about your book, is it wasn't just platitudes on leadership. Like, here's some nice things to say about leadership and how to live it. It's like practical. Here's how to help people be able to work better. And I think that it can lead a conversation in with this AI frontier. Here's how we can integrate people and help people to work more efficiently with it.
Laura, I have to say, you've actually mentioned one of my favorite words, platitudes. It's actually something I despise to my core. It's like the worst fear would be to write a book of platitudes. And my favorite one is buy low, sell high. Technically correct, but not really useful, right? It's all about the how. So I just love that you brought that up. Like one should be suspicious of platitudes.
Well, we appreciate your time here today. Thanks for coming on the podcast. It was a very enlightening conversation, and I would love to continue it more. So maybe we can do that. But thanks for joining us to discuss DevOps Decrypted on this podcast. We hope you're enjoying the show. Let us know what you think on social media at Adaptavist. We look forward to keeping this conversation going there. So for Gene Kim and our Adaptavist panel, which includes Jobin, Rasmus, Matt, and Neal, I'm Laura Larimore, and DevOps Decrypted is part of the Adaptavist Live Podcast Network.